Welcome everyone, and thank you for tuning into our presentation on Google Economics, data, complex models, and well-informed policymaking. My name is Connelly, and this is Carla Coburger. We are researchers at Rebuilding Macroeconomics, a project led by our co-author, Professor Doyne, and it was commissioned by the Rebuilding Macroeconomics program, which is funded by the ESRC. Data is, without overstating, the colour palette which we chose in order to paint a picture of our economies. The choice of the colour crucially determines the final picture and how we therefore understand our world. The main colour we are using at the moment is GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, which states the monetary sum of all finished goods and services by one economy. However, the origin of this colour lies back in the 1940s when the US government wanted to develop a way to measure its total capacity to produce without revealing that its expenditure on armaments was reducing the national output. Thus, the definition of national income, the sum total of goods, services, and net foreign income, was replaced with the concept of gross national product, an index for calculating national growth and a measurement of the market value of goods and services, and ultimately gross domestic product. In this historic moment, the father of the first national income statistics, Simon Kuznets, emphasized the need for measuring economic welfare rather than just output. Unfortunately, the political will in the UK and the US asked for providing more quantitative frameworks for calculating spending for wartime mobilization. Bottom line, the main colour we are seeing when we are looking at our economies right now is still one that highlights a productive capacity made with the intention to justify wartime spending. The crucial question then becomes not only if this is what we want to understand from our macroeconomies, such as finished goods and services, unemployment and inflation, while not including measures of well-being and social interaction. But it also poses the question if this colour actually paints a sufficient and realistic picture of how our economies have developed over the past 70 years. We argue that we need new forms of data, different measurements, new reporting legislation, and the ability for economic researchers to include this data in their macroeconomic models. The COVID pandemic has revealed how little we are able to see about how our economies actually work, how industries are connected to one another. In an age of remote working, for example, how does Zoom factor into productive capacity? How does social distancing change our social interaction and, by extension, our economic activities? How can we restart our economies, and what are the welfare implications if we cannot socially interact with other people face to face? Because of the crisis, we begin to see the necessity of new forms of data and enhance our collective imagination about what the complex nature of our macroeconomic picture must be in order to understand more about the real world and the real economy. Our feedback objective is to get feedback from an interdisciplinary audience on how other fields manage data access, also regarding the conceptualization of data and its challenges. And we're also looking for feedback from policymakers on how to turn technological advances and growing scientific demand for data into a reality.
The fundamental driver for economists is ideally to explore ways to enhance our understanding of the real world and gain knowledge about it. But drawing on our introduction, economists are facing a fundamental problem. Our theoretical lens is crucially interdependent with the data available to us. Which economic student did not hear the sentence from their final thesis supervisor? Before you start your research, check if you have enough data to investigate it. This interdependency means that our theoretical frameworks, which drive our research agendas, are highly dependent on the data that is available. At the same time, our theories determine what kind of economic data is being collected. As long as we understand GDP as the main source of insight into the success of economies, we will only see the world in shades of green. There's no need to explore different forms of data because our collective imagination fails us to seek, to urge, exploring more. Hence, we are stuck in a reinforcing cycle which prohibits us to ask novel questions such as, which intermediate industries are key for our basic economic functioning in the middle of a pandemic. As a result of this, our economic models cannot come up with more nuanced policy recommendations. Economics faces two fundamental problems. The first one is about confidentiality and the lack of access that we have to data. This lack of access is equally present for data harvested by commercial companies as well as data sets held and collected by government institutions. While confidentiality is meant to protect private data from revealing sensitive information about one individual, we already possess the technological capacity to anonymize personal data so that it cannot be used to identify individuals. Combining this with strict protocols would ensure the datasets cannot be linked in a way that it becomes possible to identify subjects whose data had been collected. Later in our presentation, we will provide examples of countries that are already collecting fine-grained individual data without violating confidentiality. Furthermore, confidentiality that protects commercial data is meant to protect companies from being singled out and losing competitiveness by revealing sensitive information. Here, the argument would be that with stricter legislation and enforcement of data disclosure, no one company could be singled out, or by contrast, claim exemptions. Market competitiveness could continue, but in an environment of universal disclosure, that creates a level playing field. The second fundamental problem we are facing is that we need different data, new data and new measurements to turn information into data. Some of the data we are lacking is not recorded for political reasons. For example, during the discussion around governments supporting companies during the COVID-19 pandemic, different European states stepped forward demanding that only those companies without affiliation to tax havens should receive taxpayer support. Countries very quickly hit the barrier that even if they wanted to make that distinction, they could not, because they didn't know which of their companies had affiliations and which didn't. It became an issue of lack of data and not knowing and not having a way to know. Data that the European Commission identified as crucial to be collected in order to answer these questions are very basic ones, such as number of employees, net revenue, including money exchanged between third parties and between business units of a group, profit before tax, and income tax due and paid each year. Secondly, we need new data. As introduced earlier, there is a growing economy of so-called intangible goods that have become key to our economies, which are we still struggling to quantify and include in our models. Intangible goods are goods and services that do not have a physical nature, such as in-house branding, training, capital investment, and also cloud computing are similarly identified as areas of intangible measurements that can be tackled by accounting, innovation, and reform. It also includes the uptake of free services or platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and all their related services, such as Gmail, WhatsApp, etc. Novel data sources, ONS surveys, and literature reviews have been used to produce new methodologies and estimates of expenditure on branding, time use, in-house software, advertising, market research, and training investment. The last subcategory of measurements considers the measurement of social interaction and how we will be able to theorize it. There has been a large body of literature that deals with understanding well-being of people, its source and impact for economic activity. A category such as well-being and happiness might be crucial to understand the impact of policies, but they're very difficult to quantify because of the nature of not being intersubjectively shared. The third challenge has to do with conflicting cultures of data sharing and accessibility in different countries. We found that Nordic and Scandinavian countries are less hindered by concerns for privacy because their culture of data sharing dates back almost to the 1800s. Even though the data sharing culture is not a fundamental problem of economics and they differ from country to country, it can be the determining factor if new legislation will be successful. Drawing on these examples and the positive example that these countries staged in their data collection, our main proposition is that we are facing a perceived conflict between confidentiality and gathering of fine-grained data. Because of the nature of that perceived conflict, we are facing a lack of vision and political will to realize a different form of data collection that can lead to better economic models and better policy insights. But by using big data, which includes collecting data of which a lot is already being harvested by technological companies like Facebook, Google, and Amazon, it allows us to gain new insights into how our economies work and how they relate and interconnect with each other. The legislative requirements that we are asking for must be the starting point to ensure the following: harmonized disclosure standards. Universal commercial transparency would create an even playing field in which no one company could claim greater commercial advantage by claiming exemptions based on claims of confidentiality. Secondly, we would lay the foundation to provide infrastructure for data storage and sharing. And lastly, preventing data collection and accessibility to be used as a political agenda setting tool. In order to support our proposition, we have structured our report in the following way. We briefly discuss philosophy of data and the different ways the relationships between models and the real world have been theorized, examining ontological and epistemological considerations. We then examine the history of the national accounts to make sense of how sources of economic data have been used for public discussion, policymaking, and modeling. We then discuss the results of the interviews we conducted with economists, academics, and policymakers to find out what data they would like access to, but cannot get hold of, and conducted a survey of existing macro and micro data sets and their availability. We then summarize the conceptualization of challenges with regards to data access and examine issues of confidentiality, measurements, and the culture of data collecting and sharing, as I've just referred to, and then lay out our vision for Google Economics and why it is not utopian. Our vision of Google Economics is creating an environment where any person can theoretically point their smartphone at any business or building and have it bring up all information about its economic activities. In the broader sense, that information would include goods and services that are produced within its walls, manufacturing materials that are used in its production, the region it is located in, the price of materials, the cost of shipping, the supply chain of its goods, the occupation of its staff, knowledge and skills that exist within each company, their contractual agreements, laws regulating operations, the ecology of innovation and wealth of its owners, as well as the fine-grained data on the local areas and neighborhoods around that building and its influence. Yeah. When we're discussing Google Economics, we're not proposing to develop a product. This isn't a pitch meeting with Google. Our intention is to illustrate what we don't know. It is a vehicle to present the idea of how much missing knowledge we have. Navigating economic data should be as easy as using Google Maps. But first, the data must be publicly available.
If we want better policy, we need better data, and data that better reflects the real economy. The question then becomes one of pragmatic parameters for data access. Who should have the right to access data, and for what purposes? For us, it comprises three main points: ethics, privacy, and technology, and how these three aspects should operate in conjunction in policymaking and economic modeling. Certain countries have demonstrated that there is much greater scope for data-driven modeling than currently exists in countries like the UK, Australia, and the US. While Nordic and Scandinavian countries have a long-standing history and culture of transparency that supports data sharing, we also examine the Chilean example, a country that has only recently increased its data reporting requirements for both companies and individuals. These small changes have made it possible to reconstruct the Chilean production network at a fine-grained company and product level. This example shows that open data is a question of vision and political will to increase transparency and data collection.
Obtaining disaggregated fine-grained data on an individual and firm level is a necessity in order to gain knowledge into existential questions that researchers are investigating. One is obviously COVID-19. Our colleague, Professor Doyne recently investigated the product and network structure of the UK economy in relation to how to reopen the economy in a post-COVID environment and how our economies depend on centralized industries. The paper demonstrates how important it is for us to actually understand how industries are connected to each other in order to gain insights and knowledge about policymaking within a pandemic. The second issue is climate change, a crisis that is so complex and involves so many areas of our social lives, our economies, and our environment that it is no longer sufficient to have aggregated data. Disaggregated fine-grained data is the only chance for us to understand the emergent properties of our economies by modeling our economies at the finest possible scale and using simulations unifying macro and microeconomics and provide us a vastly better understanding of our economies. We therefore need harmonized, interlinking, anonymized, fine-grained data sets that are standardized both in terms of measurements and format. Many thanks for listening to our presentation and looking forward to seeing you at the live discussion.